A biopic simply titled Michael made $217 million worldwide in its very first weekend. Now that's huge because a dead man of 17 years just out-opened Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. But isn't this the same Michael who had 4 more people come forward on the very day the film was released with a new sexual abuse lawsuit? As shocking as it is, this is true. So how does a star this iconic, this dragged through the mud, still command a theater near you? And it's not just the box office. Right now, Billie Jean is sitting at number 2 globally on Spotify. On a single day in May 2026, 10 of his songs crossed 2 million daily plays simultaneously. A man who has been dead for almost 2 decades is competing with Justin Bieber for the number 1 song on Spotify right now in 2026. How do you explain that conundrum? A star so celebrated he is practically mythology. So controversial, half the world wants to cancel him and the other half is buying tickets. Well, to understand it, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to watch The Making of Michael Jackson. The Making of Michael, Gary, Indiana, 1964. A 2-bedroom house packed with 9 children, 1 mother, and a strict father. Joseph Walter Jackson was a crane operator by day and a guitar player by night. He was a man who had dreams of his own that never came true, and when they didn't, he transferred every single one of those dreams onto his kids. But unfortunately, he didn't do it with love. He did it with pressure, with punishment, with a belt in his hand. Michael was 6 years old when Joe first put him on stage. While the other kids and Gary were riding bikes and watching cartoons, Michael was rehearsing choreography until his feet hurt. Missed a note, he was hit. Cried about it. He was mocked for being soft. Michael later revealed he would physically feel sick the moment Joe walked into a room. His own father had become a source of terror. But the world was loving the performances of that 6-year-old boy at the same time. The Jackson 5 was originally called the Jackson Brothers, and it started winning local talent shows in 1965. By 1967, they won Amateur Night at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. If you know anything about music history, you know the Apollo doesn't just give that away. By 1969, Diana Ross herself introduced them to the world. Their first Motown single was I Want You Back, and it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1970. Then ABC, then The Love You Save, then I'll Be There. 4 number 1 singles back to back. But behind every sold-out show was a boy who had no childhood to speak of. No school friends, no normal. His whole life was scheduled and sold. By his teenage years, Michael was already a global star and completely alone. But isolation does something to a person, and for Michael, it made him obsessive. It made him hungry. Because if the world was going to watch him, he was going to give them something they had never seen before. The rise of a legend. In 1979, Michael Jackson was 21 years old and done being a sideman. He released Off the Wall and announced to the world that he was a solo superstar who didn't need his brothers, didn't need Motown, and didn't need anyone's permission. The album sold over 20 million copies, 4 top 10 singles, a Grammy for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance, but Michael wanted to do something better. So he made Thriller. It was 1982, when working again with legendary producer Quincy Jones, Michael released Thriller. This iconic album spent 37 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It stayed in the top 10 for 80 weeks, produced 7 Billboard Hot 100 top 10 singles. Billie Jean, Beat It, Wanna Be Startin' Something. These are songs that still define what pop music should sound like. It is to this day the best-selling album in history. Over 70 million copies sold worldwide. Then came March 25th, 1983, NBC's Motown 25 special. 47 million people were watching live, and Michael performed Billie Jean and halfway through, he did something with his feet that made the entire world stop breathing. The moonwalk. That iconic moonwalk. It was stolen from the street dancers he had been studying quietly for years, but Michael refined it in secret and then unleashed it on the biggest stage he'd ever had. The applause didn't stop. At the 26th Grammy Awards, Thriller won 8 Grammys in a single night. Michael and Quincy Jones took home Producer of the Year. Beat It won Record of the Year. Billie Jean won Best R&B Song. He also took home 8 American Music Awards the same year, becoming the youngest artist ever to receive the Award of Merit. And then the Thriller short film, 14 minutes, a full cinematic zombie horror story wrapped around a pop song. It doubled album sales overnight and won a Grammy for the best long-form music video. MTV had never seen anything like it. Nobody had. By 1984, Michael had signed a $10 million Pepsi deal. It was the biggest celebrity endorsement in history at that time. In 1985, he co-wrote We Are the World with Lionel Richie. He gathered 45 of the biggest artists alive into one recording studio for one night. The song raised over $60 million for African famine relief. Then he quietly purchased the ATV music catalog for $47 million. This was a huge deal because it included the rights to over 250 Beatles songs. This business move made him one of the most powerful figures in the music industry. In 1987, the Bad World Tour made over $125 million. Michael Jackson wasn't just the biggest pop star on the planet. By 1989, Elizabeth Taylor stood at the Soul Train Heritage Awards and gave him a title the world would immediately accept: the King of Pop. President George H.W. Bush named him the Artist of the Decade. He was riding on fame. At that peak, he built Neverland Ranch, a 2,700-acre property in California with its own zoo, amusement park, movie theater, and train station. This eccentric place became Michael's home. At that time, he was the most famous human being on the planet, untouchable, mythological. And then came 1993, the first allegations. Sometimes, the most devastating stories begin with the most ordinary moments. For Michael Jackson, it started with a broken car in Beverly Hills. Michael had taken his vehicle to an auto shop where he met a dentist named Evan Chandler. He was a charming man with big Hollywood dreams and a 13-year-old son named Jordan. Michael, being Michael, immediately connected with the boy. He showered the Chandler family with gifts, including expensive vacations, computers, jewelry, even a brand new car. He invited Jordan to Neverland constantly. Now, to most people, this looked like Michael's typical generosity. He had always gravitated towards children, towards innocence, towards the world he never got to have. But Evan Chandler saw something else entirely. He saw an opportunity. By mid-1993, Jordan was practically living at Neverland. Phone recordings revealed he and Michael spoke for hours every single night, sometimes until dawn. Jordan's mother publicly defended Michael, calling him a wonderful friend to the family. But what Michael didn't know at the time was that Evan had already made his move. Evan approached Michael's representatives and demanded a $20 million film development deal. When Michael's team refused, Evan threatened to accuse Michael of molesting his own son. In fact, Evan was recorded making that threat. His phone call was taped, in which he was talking about how everything was going according to a certain plan that wasn't just his. There were other people involved. Now, that is not how a concerned father speaks. That is how a blackmailer speaks. But the tape was never allowed as court evidence, and by August 1993, the allegations were public. Michael's world shook just like that. The LAPD and Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office launched a full criminal investigation. Jordan was interviewed by a psychiatrist who would later become controversial for his theories on false memories in children. During those sessions, Jordan allegedly provided detailed physical descriptions of Michael's body, These descriptions became the foundation for what came next. December 20th, 1993. A date Michael would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. He was summoned to a private room and forced to undergo a full-body strip search conducted by LAPD detectives. They photographed every inch of him, trying to match Jordan's statement to Michael's vitiligo-affected skin. The most private person in entertainment, a man who wore masks and gloves just to walk outside, forced to stand naked while strangers documented his body like a crime scene. Michael later said it was the moment he had lost all faith in the justice system. He later appeared on national television in a pre-recorded statement, dressed in black, voice trembling. "I am totally innocent of any wrongdoing, and I know these terrible allegations will all be proven false." Everyone could see that he was already disintegrating. He canceled the rest of the Dangerous World Tour. His weight dropped so much. At this point, he was also taking Demerol. In fact, he was dependent on this opioid. He started taking it after he burnt his scalp during a Pepsi commercial fire in 1984. By this point, the stress had turned his occasional use into a daily dependency. The media smelled blood, and they feasted. Hundreds of journalists camped outside Neverland. Tabloids printed stories about secret tunnels and satanic rituals, but there was not a single piece of evidence behind any of it. And that's why Michael was never arrested, never charged, never put on trial. In January of 1994, his legal team negotiated a $23 million civil settlement with the Chandler family. To most people watching, that looked like a confession. Why would an innocent man pay that kind of money? But what most people missed is that settlement only closed the civil case. The criminal investigation was still wide open. Police could still have arrested Michael at any moment if evidence existed, but the moment the settlement was signed, Jordan Chandler stopped cooperating with prosecutors entirely. He refused to testify, wouldn't speak to investigators, and without the alleged victim's testimony, the criminal case collapsed. Now that is not how real victims behave. That is how extortion victims behave. The case closed, but the damage never did. Michael survived 1993, but barely. Michael picked himself up, released history, got married, and tried to rebuild. But trauma has a long memory, and so did the people who wanted him gone. Because 10 years later, the accusations came back, and this time with handcuffs. The downward spiral. In 2003, a British journalist convinced Michael to open Neverland's doors for a documentary. Michael was always desperate to control his own narrative, so he agreed. It was one of the worst decisions of his life. Living with Michael Jackson aired in February and broke the internet before the internet could really be broken. In one scene, Michael sat next to a 13-year-old cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo, holding his hand, and told the camera that sharing his bed with children was a beautiful thing. Now that clip spread worldwide within hours, and days later, Gavin accused Michael of child sexual abuse. A grand jury indicted him on 7 counts of molestation. The case was handed to District Attorney Tom Sneddon. This was the same man who investigated Michael in 1993 and walked away empty-handed. This time, it was personal. The arrest was televised. The mugshot went everywhere. The trial in 2005 became the most-watched courtroom drama since O.J. Simpson. At the time, the man couldn't breathe without it becoming breaking news. After 14 weeks and 130 witnesses, he was found not guilty on all 14 counts. But walking out of the courtroom free didn't mean walking out whole. The trial had financially destroyed him. Neverland was now a debt he couldn't service. He left America, Bahrain, Ireland, rented houses, never settled, never really landed anywhere. The drug dependency was now too much for him to control. Michael was using a surgical anesthetic at this point just to fall asleep. In his bedroom, it was administered nightly by a private doctor whom Michael used to pay $150,000 a month. When he announced his comeback in 2009, people thought everything was getting better. 50 shows at London's O2. 1 million tickets were gone in a single day. But maybe he was never meant to make his comeback. On June 25th of 2009, Michael Jackson went into cardiac arrest in his rented Los Angeles home. 50 years old, and he was gone, just like that. The greatest entertainer who had ever lived died alone in someone else's house, and the world lost its mind. How did it end? People wept on streets in Tokyo, London, Lagos, Sao Paulo. Places that didn't even share a language were unified by one man's death. His This Is It rehearsal film rushed to cinemas and made $260 million in 2 weeks. He was dead, but he was still outselling everyone alive. What never sat right with a lot of people was that there were 2 massive criminal investigations, hundreds of detectives, years of surveillance, and not a single charge ever stuck. Even Wade Robson and James Safechuck defended him in court, but their intention was never right. The same men later said Michael abused them. But the suspicious thing is that they only came forward with those stories after Michael was dead and couldn't respond. Convenient timing for a man worth $2 billion to his estate. And what about everything else the world did to him? His vitiligo was a real, painful, documented medical condition, and it was turned into a punchline on every late-night show for 20 years. His appearance, his voice, his sensitivity were mocked on television while he was still breathing. He was publicly humiliated in ways no other artist of his generation ever experienced. The word wacko jacko was used so casually, so cruelly, that people forgot there was an actual human being attached to it. So was he framed by people who saw an opportunity? Did the media turn him into a target because scandal sells better than the truth? Or was Michael Jackson really a bad person, hiding in plain sight behind the glitter, the glove, and the greatest music catalog ever assembled? Hero, villain, victim, monster. The world has never agreed, and maybe that's the most Michael Jackson thing of all. But you tell me, what's your take on this? My comment section is open.